It was the kind of day that felt like any other. I sat in that cold, sterile courtroom, hands trembling as I waited for the judge to announce my fate. My name is Malik Turner, and I was just another teenager caught in the system, with no hope for a fair trial. I knew what was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the shock I was about to face. I had been wrongfully accused of a crime I didn't commit. A petty theft. It sounded so trivial, but in a town like ours, accusations like this had a way of sticking, even if they were baseless. The whispers started almost immediately after my arrest, and now, sitting here, I could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on me. Judge Mitchell stood at the bench, her gavel raised, ready to make the call. She glanced at me with a look of disdain, like she already knew my fate. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, but she didn't seem to notice the nervousness in the air, or the faint murmurs of the spectators. She didn't care. "Malik Turner," she began, her voice cold and indifferent, "you've been accused of stealing a wallet from a local business. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," I replied, barely able to keep my voice steady. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. The judge paused for a moment, then motioned to the prosecutor, who stood with a smug grin, as though he already had me locked away. His name was Daniel Carter. He had always been a figure of authority in this town, one who never questioned anything, especially when it came to cases like mine. "You're wasting the court's time, Mr. Turner," Judge Mitchell finally said, dismissing my plea as though it were inconsequential. "This is a clear case, and we're going to proceed." But I knew, deep down, that something was off. Something was wrong. This wasn't just about a stolen wallet, it was about something far deeper. And I wasn't the only one who knew it. The tension in the courtroom thickened, and I could feel every eye on me. Just as the judge was about to pass her sentence, something happened that changed everything. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I had no idea who could be calling me now, but I had a feeling it was someone important. Without thinking, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was my sister, Aaliyah. I answered quickly, trying to mask my voice with a casual tone. "Aaliyah?" Her voice came through urgently. "Malik, you need to call him now. Right now. I can't believe it's happening again." My heart raced as Aaliyah's words echoed in my mind. "Call him now." I thought, but before I could ask anything else, she cut me off. "Malik, it's serious. They've framed you. It's not just a mistake. They're doing this on purpose. You have to call him now. You know who I mean." I froze for a moment. My brother, Michael Turner, the U.S. Attorney General. The man who had built his career fighting for justice. The man who had always warned me about corruption, even in places where you least expected it. He told me there would come a time when I'd have to call him, but I never thought it would be like this. I glanced at Judge Mitchell, who was now looking at me with irritation, clearly impatient with my distraction. She gave a sharp motion with her hand, signaling for me to stop wasting time. But I knew what I had to do. Taking a deep breath, I excused myself. "Your Honor, I need to make an urgent call." She raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "This is highly unorthodox, Mr. Turner." But I was past caring about her disapproval. I needed to make this call. My hands were shaking, but I dialed the number to Michael's direct line, praying he'd pick up. The phone rang twice before his deep, calm voice came through. "Malik, what's going on?" "Mike, they're framing me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I didn't do anything. Judge Mitchell's ready to convict me without any real evidence. You have to do something." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Michael's voice came through, firm and commanding. "Stay calm. I'm on my way." I hung up, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time since I'd stepped into this courtroom. My brother, Michael, was coming. He was the U.S. Attorney General, one of the most powerful men in the country. If anyone could stop this travesty, it was him. But deep down, I knew that even with his influence, the system wasn't going to back down easily. There were too many people here with too much to lose. I could feel the eyes of the room on me as I returned to my seat. Judge Mitchell glared at me, obviously irritated by the delay. She cleared her throat loudly, signaling that she was about to continue with the proceedings. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice clipped, "unless you have something more to add, we will proceed with the trial." I didn't trust her. Not for a second. She'd already made up her mind about me, about my guilt. It didn't matter that I had an alibi or that the supposed evidence against me was flimsy at best. All that mattered was that I was the target in her eyes. The clock was ticking, and I needed Michael to get here before this thing was over. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, leaned forward, a smug grin creeping across his face. He knew this was his moment. The moment when I'd be silenced, when my life would be ruined over a crime I didn't commit. "Your Honor, I motion that we proceed to closing statements," Carter said, as though he had already won. Judge Mitchell nodded, signaling for him to continue. But just as Carter began to speak, the courtroom doors slammed open. I could feel the room shift, like something had just changed in the air. "Your Honor," came a voice that rang out with authority, "this trial is over." The entire room turned to face the entrance. Standing there, with a commanding presence, was Michael. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and his expression was cold, resolute. The way he carried himself made it clear that he wasn't here for any negotiations. He was here to make sure justice was served. Judge Mitchell's face drained of color. She stood up, visibly taken aback, but Michael wasted no time. He stepped into the courtroom, his eyes locking onto hers. "Judge Mitchell," he began, his voice unwavering, "this trial has been compromised. You've been trying to railroad my brother from the beginning, and it stops now." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Judge Mitchell stared at Michael, clearly rattled by his sudden appearance. She was used to being the one in control, the one who made the rules, but here was someone with far more power than she could ever command. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner, but you have no place here," Judge Mitchell began, her voice faltering slightly. Michael's sharp gaze cut her off. "Actually, Judge, I do. And I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure you're held accountable for your actions." Her face flushed with anger, but she quickly masked it with her usual stern demeanor. "This is a court of law, not a circus. You cannot just barge in and, no, you can't just frame an innocent teenager and call it justice," Michael shot back, his tone lethal. "Not while I'm here." The judge hesitated, clearly shaken by the presence of the U.S. Attorney General in her courtroom. She was a seasoned judge, but even she understood that the stakes had just been raised to a level she wasn't prepared for. Michael turned to Carter, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "You've been pushing for this young man's conviction without solid evidence, haven't you?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "And you've known all along that he's innocent. But it doesn't matter to you, does it?" Carter's face contorted with surprise, then frustration. He had thought this case was a done deal, but now his entire world was shifting beneath him. "Mr. Turner, I assure you, this is an open and shut case." "You can't just," Carter began, but Michael interrupted him. "Shut up," Michael said coldly, the words laced with venom. "This case is over. Your time to manipulate the law for your own agenda is finished." Judge Mitchell opened her mouth to protest, but Michael raised his hand, silencing her with a gesture. "We both know what this is about, don't we? You and your little team have been targeting my brother from the moment this case started. This is nothing more than a power play, a chance to send a message. Well, the only message you're sending is that you've underestimated me." There was a flicker of panic in the judge's eyes now. She realized that Michael wasn't just a politician or a figurehead. He was a force, and he was here to end this injustice. I felt a weight lift off my chest as I watched my brother take control. The courtroom had shifted, the tide was turning, and finally, I wasn't alone anymore. The tension in the room was unbearable as Michael stood there, unyielding and calm, in the face of Judge Mitchell's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. She looked around at the courtroom like a person stranded in a sinking ship, her eyes darting from Michael to the prosecutor and back to me, as if searching for someone to back her up. But no one moved. No one dared to speak. The reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just about a courtroom drama anymore. This was a moment of reckoning. The walls that had once confined me to the fate they'd written for me were crumbling. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people who had tried to bury it were starting to panic. Michael turned back to me, his face softened for the first time since he'd walked in. "Malik, you all right?" I nodded, the tension in my chest loosening slightly. "Yeah. I'm good now. I didn't know if I was going to make it out of here." His gaze hardened again as he turned to Judge Mitchell, who was now visibly sweating. "This is over. You've been caught in a lie. The evidence was fabricated, and you've been complicit in this entire sham." Judge Mitchell clenched her fists at the bench, clearly struggling to find her footing. "You don't know what you're talking about. I have the law on my side, Mr. Turner. Your brother may be powerful, but that doesn't mean you can come in here and dictate what happens in my courtroom." Michael smiled coldly. "No, but it does mean I can expose every single one of your dirty little secrets. Every time you've bent the rules, every time you've ignored the truth, I have it all right here." He pulled a file from his briefcase and slammed it onto the judge's desk. The thick stack of papers landed with a resounding thud. The color drained from Judge Mitchell's face as she glanced down at the file, her eyes scanning the contents. The air felt electric, crackling with the realization that her corruption was no longer hidden, that her abuse of power was now exposed for all to see. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his earlier smugness gone. He glanced nervously at Judge Mitchell, waiting for her to somehow take control again. But she was lost. And so was he. Michael took a step forward, his voice even, but commanding. "This trial is over. Malik is free to go. And if anyone here tries to continue this, they'll have to answer to me." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for the judge to make her move. But there was no escape for her. No clever words to undo what had been done. Finally, Judge Mitchell slumped back into her chair. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice low, but Michael cut her off with a single, piercing look. "Oh, it is," he said. "This is just the beginning." As Michael's words hung in the air, I could feel the weight of the moment settle over the room like a heavy fog. It was clear that Judge Mitchell had just been handed the harshest truth of her career, and the consequences would be far-reaching. She slumped in her seat, her usual poise shattered, while the prosecutor, Carter, seemed to shrink under the weight of Michael's presence. But Michael wasn't finished. He turned to the courtroom attendants, his voice steady but powerful. "Remove the file. Get it into the hands of the authorities. Immediately. And I want a full investigation into everything, every decision, every ruling, everything Judge Mitchell has done during this trial." The courtroom attendants, still in shock, scrambled to carry out his orders. It was like watching a machine spring into action, all directed by the steady hand of my brother. Michael was a force to be reckoned with, and the system would no longer protect those who abused their power. I stood there, still trying to absorb everything that had just happened. My hands were no longer shaking, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The fear that had plagued me for so long, that relentless nagging feeling of impending doom, was finally lifting. The truth had come crashing through like a wrecking ball, and for the first time, I wasn't the one on the wrong side of it. Michael turned to me then, his expression softening again. "Malik, I know this has been hard. But it's over now. They won't be able to hurt you anymore." I nodded, grateful beyond words, but the reality of what had just happened was still sinking in. I'd been framed. Manipulated. But my brother had come through when I needed him most. He'd uncovered everything. "Thanks, Mike," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He gave me a reassuring smile. "We'll talk later. Right now, we need to make sure this is handled properly. They can't get away with this." The tension in the room slowly started to break as the attendants took the evidence and left. Judge Mitchell, still fuming, didn't speak. She knew there was nothing she could do now. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. And there was no going back. Carter, who had been so confident moments ago, stood there looking lost, like a man who had just realized the foundation of everything he'd worked for was crumbling beneath his feet. He looked at Michael, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear, but Michael wasn't paying him any more attention. He was already turning to leave the courtroom, his mission accomplished. I followed him, my steps lighter than they had been in what felt like forever. "Let's get you out of here," Michael said, his voice full of calm authority. As we walked out, I could hear murmurs from the courtroom behind us, the people who had witnessed the entire ordeal. Some were still in shock, others were whispering excitedly, as if they could hardly believe what had just transpired. But I knew one thing for sure, the system had just been shaken to its core. As we stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, the weight of everything that had just happened started to settle on me. I felt like I was walking on air, yet I couldn't shake the nagging thought that this wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had been wronged by a system that too often turned a blind eye to injustice. Michael led me down the hallway, his presence as commanding as ever, but there was a subtle tension in the way he carried himself now. His work wasn't done, not by a long shot. The investigation into Judge Mitchell and the prosecutor, Carter, was just beginning. I had no doubt that they were going to fight back, try to cover their tracks, and possibly even retaliate. But Michael had the resources to take them down, and I knew he wouldn't stop until every last one of them was held accountable. We reached the elevator, and Michael pressed the button. I stood silently next to him, still processing what had just unfolded. I had been prepared for the worst. I had thought I was going to prison, that my life was going to be ruined by a crime I didn't commit. But now, everything had changed. I had a future again. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped inside. As the doors closed, Michael turned to me, his face still serious but with a hint of relief in his eyes. "I want you to know, Malik, that this isn't just about you," he said, his voice low. "It's about everyone who's ever been caught in a system that's designed to punish them before they even get a fair shot. The corruption, the lies, it all stops here." I nodded, understanding what he meant. Michael had always been about more than just winning cases. He had dedicated his life to making sure that justice was truly served, that the system didn't exploit the powerless. And now, this case was going to serve as a wake-up call for anyone who thought they could manipulate the law to their advantage. As the elevator descended, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. I was free. Not just from the charges, but from the constant fear, the uncertainty of whether or not I would ever be able to clear my name. Michael had given me that freedom. When the doors opened on the ground floor, we stepped out into the lobby, where a few reporters had gathered. Michael barely acknowledged them as we made our way to the exit, his focus entirely on me. He had one last thing to say before we left the building. "Malik," he said, stopping for a moment, "this is just the beginning. They'll try to smear your name, but don't let them. You've got the truth on your side now. And I'll always have your back." I looked up at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Mike. I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael's expression softened as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You never have to worry about that. Not as long as I'm around." With that, we walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the battle behind us but the fight far from over. The next steps would be difficult, but I wasn't facing them alone anymore. As we stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air, I took a deep breath. The world felt different now, clearer somehow, as if the fog that had clouded my mind for so long was finally lifting. The weight of the courtroom, of those crushing accusations, no longer hung over me like a storm cloud ready to break. But even as I savored that brief moment of relief, I knew that it wasn't over. Michael's voice was steady beside me, but there was an edge to it. He was always thinking 2 steps ahead, and right now, his mind was racing with what came next. We're not just fighting for your name, Malik. This is bigger. There are people in that system who think they're untouchable, that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again, for anyone. I nodded, understanding fully now what he meant. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was about taking down a broken system, one that had been rigged to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. If Michael and I could make an example of Judge Mitchell and Daniel Carter, maybe it would send a message to others who thought they could operate above the law. We got into the car, and Michael immediately pulled out his phone, dialing someone I didn't recognize. He spoke in quick, precise sentences, arranging meetings, demanding action. I could tell this wasn't a fight that would be over in a day or even a week. This was going to take time, a lot of time. Malik, you're going to have to stay out of the spotlight for a while, he said after hanging up. There's going to be backlash. There are going to be people who will try to discredit you, to make you seem like the villain in all this. But you've got to stay focused. Let me handle the legal stuff, and you stay clear of the media frenzy. I understood what he was saying. The truth had come out, but now the battle for public perception would begin. People would try to twist the narrative, to paint me as something I wasn't. But I had to trust Michael to fight that fight for me. How long do you think it'll take? I asked, my voice steady, though I couldn't deny the nerves still creeping up on me. I wasn't used to being at the center of such a large-scale battle. Michael gave me a look that was part reassurance, part determination. We'll get them, Malik. I'm not going to let this go. It might take time, but I promise you, this ends with them being held accountable. As we drove off, I couldn't help but glance at the courthouse one last time in the rearview mirror. For a moment, it felt like everything was behind me. But I knew the real fight was just beginning. The days following the courtroom drama felt like a blur, and yet, everything had changed. I stayed in the background, just as Michael had instructed, while the media swirled around the case, creating its own narrative. The headlines were unpredictable, some portraying me as a victim, others as a pawn in a larger game. But I ignored all of that. Michael had always said that the truth was a weapon, and I was content to let him wield it. Behind the scenes, things were moving quickly. Michael had already set the wheels in motion for a full investigation into Judge Mitchell and Daniel Carter. It wasn't just their actions in my case that were under scrutiny now, it was everything they had ever done. Michael had access to resources, to people who could dig deep into their pasts, uncovering every misstep, every questionable ruling. It wasn't just about justice for me, it was about exposing a system that had failed countless others. I didn't see much of Michael in the first few days. He was in meetings, making calls, building the case that would take down those who had manipulated me. Every time I tried to ask him for an update, he just told me to hang tight. It's moving, Malik. We're going to make sure this goes all the way. But I could sense the tension in his voice. Even though he was confident, I knew how much this meant to him. It wasn't just about the law. It was about protecting people like me, people who hadn't had a voice or the means to fight back. And he was determined to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. One night, about a week after the courtroom incident, I got a call from Michael. I could tell by the tone in his voice that something big had happened. Malik, he said, his voice sharper than usual, I need you to come with me tomorrow. We've got enough now. The investigation into Mitchell and Carter has gone public, and it's bigger than we expected. I could hear the weight in his words. This wasn't just going to be another legal battle. The media was already getting wind of the investigation, and now the spotlight was fully on Michael and the people he was taking down. I didn't know how much longer we'd be able to stay in the shadows, but I knew that once we stepped out, everything would change. Are you sure about this, Mike? I asked, feeling the gravity of the situation. I'm sure. We've got them, Malik. Now it's time for them to face the consequences. The next day, Michael and I went to a small office building in the city. The place was barely noticeable, tucked between two high-rise buildings, but the meeting inside would be anything but insignificant. Michael had arranged to meet with a group of federal investigators who had been tracking Judge Mitchell and Carter for months. They were ready to take it public, to make sure the whole country knew what had been happening in that courtroom and beyond. As we entered the room, the investigators were already seated, papers and files spread out in front of them. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, but it was tempered with the knowledge of how high the stakes had become. Michael took his seat at the head of the table, his usual calm demeanor now replaced with a determined focus. "We're going to make sure this ends with them losing everything. I want Mitchell's entire record on the table, every ruling, every case. Carter's too. We'll leave no stone unturned." The investigators nodded in agreement. They were ready. It was clear that Michael had built a network of allies, people who were just as committed to bringing justice to light as he was. The plan was in motion, and now it was time to execute it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, reports, and tense strategy sessions. Michael's plan was methodical, but the pressure was mounting. As the investigation into Judge Mitchell and Daniel Carter gained national attention, the political and legal elite began to take notice. The case wasn't just about a wrongful conviction anymore, it had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, a symbol that people weren't going to ignore. It wasn't long before the public outcry grew louder. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding accountability. News outlets were relentless in their coverage, picking apart every detail of the case. Michael, despite his usual composure, was working at a pace I had never seen before. He was everywhere, on television, in press conferences, meeting with lawmakers, making sure that the truth came out in every corner of the country. One evening, after another long day of interviews, Michael sat down with me at the kitchen table. He looked tired, but there was something else in his eyes. Something I hadn't seen before: satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of winning a case, but the satisfaction of knowing that what they were doing was making a real difference. "Malik," he said, pushing a folder towards me, "this is it. We've got them." I opened the folder, and what I saw inside was the culmination of everything Michael and his team had worked for. It was a comprehensive report on Judge Mitchell's entire career, complete with evidence of multiple instances of judicial misconduct. There were emails, phone records, and even testimony from people who had been too afraid to speak out before. And it wasn't just Mitchell. Daniel Carter's involvement was even more shocking. There was proof of his collusion with other officials, his efforts to manipulate cases for personal gain. It was damning, and there was no way they could deny it now. "Tomorrow," Michael said, his voice steady but resolute, "we're taking this to the public. The investigation is going to be official, and the charges will follow. This is over for them." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and awe at how far we'd come. For months, I had lived in fear, not just of being wrongfully convicted, but of never seeing the justice I knew I deserved. But now, I saw the full scope of Michael's fight. It wasn't just for me. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, for every system that had ever been broken. And I realized that, despite everything, it was all worth it. The next day, Michael went public with the findings. The fallout was immediate and overwhelming. The public demanded action. Judges, lawyers, and politicians who had once been untouchable were now under intense scrutiny. Michael was everywhere, on the news, on Capitol Hill, in meetings with those in power. He didn't back down. In the weeks that followed, Judge Mitchell and Daniel Carter were both forced to resign under the weight of the scandal. Criminal charges were filed. And slowly, but surely, the system that had nearly destroyed me began to shift. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. As for me, I walked out of that courtroom a free man. Not just from the charges, but from the shadow that had hung over me for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I had my life back. And, thanks to Michael, I had the chance to live it the way I was meant to. And as I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. Sometimes, they're fought with the truth. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always come to light.